Good morning. This hearing will come to order. We are continuing at the Charleston County Council Chambers in North Charleston, South Carolina. I am Jason Neubauer of the United States Coast Guard, Deputy Chief of the Office of Investigations and Analysis, Washington, D.C. I'm the Chair of the Coast Guard Marine Board Investigation and the presiding officer over these proceedings. The Commandant of the Coast Guard has convened this board under the authority of Title 46 United States Code, Section 6301, and Title 46 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 4, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the implosion of the Titan with the loss of 5 lives on June 18, 2023, while conducting deep-sea operations in the vicinity of the RMS Titanic wreck site. I have previously determined that OceanGate Incorporated is a party in interest to this investigation. OceanGate is represented by the law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton. As a designated party in interest, they have a statutory right to employ counsel to represent them, to cross-examine witnesses, and to have witnesses called on their behalf. I will examine all witnesses at this formal hearing under oath or affirmation, and witnesses will be subject to federal laws and penalties governing false official statements. Witnesses who are not parties in interest may be advised by their counsel concerning their rights. However, such counsel may not examine or cross-examine other witnesses or otherwise participate in these proceedings. These proceedings are open to the public and to the media. I ask for the cooperation of all persons present to minimize any disruptive influence on the proceedings in general and on the witnesses in particular. An area has been set aside for news media use during these proceedings. The media may question witnesses concerning the testimony that they have given after I have released them from these proceedings. I ask that such interviews be conducted outside of this courtroom. Since the date of the casualty, the National Transportation Safety Board and Coast Guard have conducted substantial evidence collection activities, and some of that previously collected evidence will be considered during these hearings. Should any person have or believe they have information not brought forward, but which might be of direct significance, that person is urged to bring that information to my attention by emailing titan@uscg.mil. The NTSB has provided a representative for this hearing. Mr. Marcel Muse, seated to my far right, is the investigator in charge for the NTSB. Mr. Muse, would you like to make a statement for the record?
Yes, good morning. My name is Marcel Muse. I am the National Transportation Safety Board's investigator in charge assigned to this accident. The NTSB has joined these proceedings to avoid the duplication of facts. Following the proceedings, the NTSB will determine a probable cause as required by law, issue a report which may include safety recommendations to prevent a future tragedy. And Mr. Chair, if it's okay, I'd like my colleague, Dr. Donald Kramer, will join us later on today.
Thank you, Mr. Muse. Before we call our first witness for the day, I need to make a clarification for the record. The Marine Board's questioning last Friday suggested that Ms. Wilby's NDA, which she signed as an independent contractor with OceanGate, might have limited her ability to raise safety concerns with OceanGate's board of directors. After conducting a legal review of her NDA, the Marine Board interprets that the agreement did not explicitly prevent Ms. Wilby from sharing the information, including her safety concerns, with OceanGate's board. However, it's important to note that Ms. Wilby testified she did not consult with legal counsel regarding the terms of her NDA, so this clarification does not conflict with her testimony about her concerns related to this agreement. There has also been a scheduling change to Friday's witness schedule. Commander Zach Robinson with the Coast Guard's Marine Safety Center will submit a report to the board for the record rather than providing testimony in person. Former OceanGate employee Mr. Matthew McCoy has been substituted into the morning witness slot for Friday. In addition, Lieutenant Commander Jim Kang, serving to my right, will be serving as counsel for the Marine Board this week in place of Lieutenant Commander Lars Oakmark. Our first witness of the day will be Mr. Guillermo Sohnlein, co-founder of the OceanGate Incorporated. Mr. Sohnlein will be testifying virtually, and we will start his session at 9 a.m. The hearing is now in recess until 9 a.m. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Sohnlein. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for allowing me to testify virtually. It would have been a long trip from Europe, but thank you.
Yes, sir. Before we begin, our recorder, Lieutenant Steele, will administer the oath, sir.
Thank you.
Could you please raise your right hand for me, sir? A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by fine and/or imprisonment under 18 USC 1001. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Sir, Lieutenant Commander Whalen will start with some questioning.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Actually, I'm sorry, Commander Whalen, before we get started, is there a way of getting the IT to show the wide view of the panel? Right now, I'm looking at 2 screenshots of me.
Yes, sir. Thank you. We'll stand by for a moment.
Okay, thank you. I got it. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for pointing that out, sir.
Thank you, sir. All of my questions will relate to the time period up to the incident of June 18th, 2023, unless I state otherwise. As I reference any exhibits, they will be made available to you on your desktop. Before we begin, I will ask you to please refrain from using any acronyms. If you should use an acronym, I will stop you and ask you to explain what the acronym means. Can you please provide me a little bit more information about your background, specifically your educational background and work experience prior to the formation of OceanGate?
Yes, I can do that. Before I get started, I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to participate in these public hearings, and then also for allowing me to testify remotely from Europe. I know you've got a big job ahead of you, and hopefully my brief testimony here today will help add at least a little bit of value to your efforts, even if all I'm doing is adding color or context to what other witnesses are presenting. So thank you again for allowing me to participate. To answer your question directly, let me start at the beginning. I was born in Argentina, raised in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Silicon Valley. I studied economics at the University of California, Berkeley, worked for a couple years at a law firm, and then went to law school at the University of California, College of the Law, San Francisco. It used to be called Hastings when I went there. Upon graduation, I took the California bar, passed, was admitted into the California bar, even though I really had no intention of practicing law. What I actually did when I graduated law school is I went into the Marine Corps. So I went there wanting to be a scout sniper platoon commander. So I went through officer candidate school in Quantico, Virginia. Then I went through 6 months of the basic school, also in Quantico, Virginia, learning how to be an infantry officer. When it came time to graduate and pick my MOS, my military occupational specialty, I graduated high enough in my class that there was actually a slot available for a scout sniper platoon commander. But for personal and family reasons, I made a decision to choose 4402, which was judge advocate. And so from there, I ended up going to Newport, Rhode Island, spent 3 months there learning military law, studying with my fellow Marine judge advocates, as well as members of the United States Navy and United States Coast Guard Judge Advocate Corps. From there, I was stationed at the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center in 29 Palms, California, where I spent approximately 3 years. The first 18 months or so, I was the installation law officer, which meant that effectively I was the legal advisor to the commanding general, who at the time was a 2-star major general. And then for the second 18 months, I was the senior defense counsel at the base. From there, I came off active duty in 1 July 1999. I remained in inactive ready reserve for the remainder of my contract, which I believe was another 4 years. When I left active duty on 1 July 1999, I was an 03 captain. And I believe that when I came off active duty, my DD 214, I believe, says 04. I think I was a major when I came out. Now, when I came off active duty, what I did is I moved my family to San Francisco and I co-founded an internet company. It was 1999 going into 2000. It was the height of the internet boom. We were at ground zero in Silicon Valley. We took that company and rode the .com bubble all the way up, and we rode the dot-com bust all the way down in 2001. We managed to sell the company to a venture-backed company called Voxeo, and I stayed on with Voxeo for, I think, another 10 months after the acquisition. During that time, I moved my family from San Francisco to the Northern Virginia area to the East Coast. And I left Voxeo in February of 2002 as that company experienced some financial issues and went through a round of layoffs, and I was part of a group of people who were laid off. From there, I decided I was going to start another company. This time I wanted to be in a field that I was passionate about. And I thought that field was going to be space. It's either going to be space or oceans. It was going to be one of those. In 2003, I started a nonprofit organization called the International Association of Space Entrepreneurs. At the time, Elon Musk had recently started SpaceX. And so there was a big group of us who wanted to encourage the next generation of Elon Musk and bring them from other industries into the space industry. So that was the objective of IASC. That was in 2003. In 2006, I started a for-profit company called Space Angels Network. And the objective of that organization was to connect accredited individual investors with early stage space ventures looking for seed funding. I ran that company until 2010, so a year after we started OceanGate. I turned it over to one of my co-founders. He ran it until 2014 or 15. He turned it over to somebody else, and that gentleman relaunched the company, rebranded it as Space Angels. He is still running it today, and because of his efforts today, that is, I think by a lot of measures, the most active early stage investor in the global space community. Now, the reason all of that's relevant is because through Space Angels Network in 2008, I met a gentleman by the name of Graham Hawks, a former aerospace engineer who was also a submersible designer. That was my first introduction to submersibles in the submersible world. And a year later, I was fascinated by it. So I actually spent the greater part of 2008, most of 2009, going back and forth from my residence in Northern Virginia and where Graham was in California, in the Bay Area, basically on a consulting basis, helping him with his business. And in that way, I learned about the submersible world and the submersible community. The reason that's important is because in summer 2009, Graham introduced me to Stockton Rush. And Graham, Stockton, and I decided we were going to go into business together. We co-founded very briefly a company called Deep Flight Technologies. Lasted only for, I'd say, a couple of months or so as Deep Flight Technologies. Graham decided to leave that, and that left me and Stockton to start a company, and that is when OceanGate was founded. So I walked you through a lot of detail, and I know it was probably more detail than you were looking for. But the reason I did that is because at the time of founding of OceanGate, I believed that what I was bringing to the table, and what I think Stockton believed I was bringing to the table, was leadership experience, because Stockton was going to put money in, but he was not going to run the company. I had startup experience, especially with the Silicon Valley kind of disruptive innovation kind of mindset. I had experience with investors and fundraising. I had a legal background. We knew that we were going to be dealing with a lot of government and regulatory compliance issues. I wasn't going to do that work. I knew we were going to have to hire legal experts to do that. But it was nice that I had a legal background, so I would know how to talk with the outside counsel. And then, even though I didn't have sub operations experience or maritime experience, I did have field ops experience from my time in the Marine Corps. So I think I gave you a lot of detail, but in summary, I think those were the kind of the bullet points that I brought to the table when we started.
Thank you, sir. Why did Mr. Graham Hawks leave Deep Flight Technologies and not move on with yourself and Mr. Rush for OceanGate?
Yeah, that is a great question that you should probably ask Graham. because I'm not sure exactly. I know that the three of us came to an agreement on putting deep flight technologies together. I got along great with both Graham and Stockton, so my deal was fairly easy to kind of carve out my role in that. And as soon as we came to that agreement, I think it was in August of 2009, I immediately started the process of relocating my family from Virginia to Seattle, where we were going to have this new company. But we still had to, paper the deal, as they say, right? We still had to lock down all of the legal agreements. And Stockton and Graham had a lot more nuances to their agreement that they were going to have to negotiate. And it was typical of co-founders coming together, right? Having to negotiate different points of the deal over a couple of months. And I think ultimately they ended up having a difference of opinion on enough things that they just decided it was not worthwhile to keep going.
When and where was...
But again, that's a great question to ask Graham, because I really don't know his side of this.
Understood. When and where was OceanGate LLC founded?
I'd have to check the official records, but my recollection is somewhere around October of 2009, and we were in Everett. I don't remember where we incorporated, if it was in Delaware or in Washington.
And what was the original vision for the company when OceanGate was launched?
How much time do I have? So I'll give you a short answer and then maybe a little bit longer answer in the context of these public hearings. The short answer is that our vision was to create a fleet of 4 or 5 deep diving submersibles. At the time, we were thinking they'd be 6,000 meters, capable of carrying 5 people, available for charter anywhere in the world, and with no dedicated mothership. When Stockton and I got together in a conference room in front of a blank whiteboard and started mapping out what the plan would be for OceanGate, that's what we came up with.
You had mentioned the vision of without a dedicated mothership. What was the purpose to not utilize a dedicated mothership, to be able to have it mobilized throughout the world?
Well, this is where we get into the longer answer. So you'll have to give me a couple minutes to kind of walk you through this, because in order to understand that, you have to understand the competitive landscape, and you have to understand the general state of the submersible community back then. And honestly, it hasn't changed much in 15 years since then. There are not that many subs in the world. Those of you doing the investigation probably got an immersion course in this over the last year. There are not that many active submersibles in the world, and certainly none in the private sector. Will Conan knows the numbers better than anyone, so when he testifies, you can ask him. But I think there are less than 100 active submersibles in the world, and almost all of them dive relatively shallow, less than 1,000 meters. And as Patrick Leahy testified on Friday, the average depth of the ocean is 4,000 meters, which covers about 65% of the ocean. So the bulk of the subs that are out there today, as in 2009, go relatively shallow. And when you consider that the ocean covers 70% of the world's the planet, it's nothing as far as trying to explore or study the world's oceans. So we wanted to change that. We wanted to give humanity greater access to the ocean, and specifically the deep ocean, anything deeper than 1,000 meters. And initially, like I said, our goal was actually 6,000 meters, because 6,000 meters gets you access to about 98% of the world's ocean. So that was kind of our goal. So you have to work backwards from there, which is, why is there not enough access for humanity to dive deep into the ocean? And one of the key reasons for this was kind of inherent in Patrick Leahy's testimony. And by the way, I've known Patrick for years and I have full respect for him, and I loved his testimony on Friday. But one question that no one asked Patrick and that he didn't volunteer and is not on his website is, how much does subs cost? And you can imagine from these intricate machines to be made as safe and as versatile as Triton subs are, they're expensive. They're millions of dollars. And they're also generally heavy. And because they require a mothership or a support ship, that support ship usually has to have a crane big enough to take the sub in and out of the water. And usually that's an A-frame, which means the ship you're instantly talking about a very big ship. And because of that, most of these subs are basically mated to dedicated mothership. And this is true of the government subs too. There are 5 deep diving government subs in the world. The French have one, the Americans have one, the Japanese have one, and I believe the Chinese have 2. And each of those is mated to a dedicated mothership, which means that you can only dive the sub wherever the ship is. And it takes a lot to move that ship, in large part because it needs a lot of fuel, which is expensive. And so if you're trying to explore the world's oceans, and given how big the world's oceans are, having 5 government subs and 5 government ships, or now the only other deep diving sub that I know, which is the Bakunawa, which was formerly the Triton built limiting factor, on one ship, that's 6 subs in the entire world, 8 billion people. It's to use someone else's words, it's a travesty for humanity that there's so few subs available to go into the deep ocean beyond 1,000 meters. So, and I know this is a very long-winded answer to what seems like a very straightforward question, but as you work backwards from the cost of the subs, the cost of operating these subs, the number one factor is actually the fuel on the ships. And the number one factor driving the fuel on the ships is the size of the ship, which is driven by the crane. And so the thought that we had early on was, if we could have these subs be pre-positioned around the world and have them so that they could operate off any ship of opportunity, so you didn't need it mated to a dedicated mothership. So you could put it in a container, a standard shipping container, ship it anywhere nearby from wherever the home base was, find a local ship that could be used, put it on board, and operate it from there. We would increase the access that humanity had to the deep oceans. Let me stop there because I don't even know if I answered your question at this point, because I went off on
No, you
a few
did.
tangents there.
Thank you. Was carbon fiber always a fundamental part of the plan for the OceanGate submersibles?
No, in fact, developing our own subs was not in the original plans. When we started OceanGate, it was just me and Stockton, and a commitment to each other that we were going to make this work. He was going to put in money, I was going to run the business. We just needed to figure out what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. At the time, we had absolutely no intention of building our own subs. Now, what we did intend to do was buy a used sub, so that, we ended up calling it our training wheel sub, so that we could learn more about subs and we could learn more about sub operations, so that when we went to build this fleet of 4 or 5 subs and deploy them around the world, we would know what we were looking for and we would know what capabilities those subs needed to have. So immediately, within a couple months of founding OceanGate, we had the opportunity to purchase Antipodes, which was an ABS class 300-meter 5-person sub, which we did buy. And we operated for the entire time that I was there until January 2015. While we were operating Antipodes, in parallel, we were trying to develop the plans for deep diving subs, because keep in mind, the vision was to have 6,000 meter capable subs. Antipodes was only 300 meters. So we knew Antipodes wasn't going to be our answer. We knew we had to find other deep diving subs. So we did a few things during the time that we were operating Antipodes. One of them was to talk to all the sub builders to find out who could get us these 5 subs that we wanted to reposition around the world. We talked with Phil Newton. We talked with Patrick Leahy and his partner Bruce Jones at Triton. We talked with Will Conan and his brother at Sea Mansion. We talked with the folks at U-Boat Works. We talked with a lot of people. And every single one of them was willing to sell us one of their subs. They were willing to take our money and build us a sub. After all, that's the business they're in, and they're very good at it. The problem was that we had very specific business requirements for these subs because of our vision. And when we put the business requirements to each of them, none of them seemed to be able to deliver what we needed to have delivered. And after a while, when you're faced with that conundrum as an entrepreneur, you've got 2 choices, right? If you based your whole business plan on having certain technology, and now the people that can build the technology are telling you it's not possible, you've got 2 choices. Well, I guess one choice is you could shut down the business, but if you want to keep the business going, you've got 2 choices. You either change your business model or you find a better engineering solution. And Stockton, being the engineer that he was, he opted for finding a better engineering solution. Because during the time that we were doing this, over the period of a couple of years, we had talked with enough other engineers that we, and Stockton in particular, convinced ourselves that it'd be possible to build a sub that would meet all of our business requirements. And so, this is again a long-winded answer, but initially we weren't even going to build our own subs. The big business innovation for us was the business model, which was chartering the subs instead of selling subs. And I guess that's something I kind of left out of the competitive landscape, right? And again, it's still true today, that if you want to dive deep, if you want to go deeper than 1,000 meters, today your only choices are to pay Triton to build you a deep diving sub, or I'm sure Sea Mansion would also do it for you, or U-Boat Works, in which case you're spending millions of dollars to buy the sub. It's going to have to be on a mothership, so you're going to have to spend tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, on a big enough ship. And then you're going to have to spend millions of dollars per year to operate the ship with the sub. And for certain people, that's perfectly viable. Triton's very good at what they do. Sea Mansion's good at what they do. U-Boat Works is good at what they do. And they make amazing subs. But the only people they can sell those to are essentially wealthy individuals. They've sold subs to tour operators and to cruise ships, but those are usually their shallower subs. They're deeper subs. I'd have to ask Patrick, or someone would have to ask Patrick, but I'm willing to bet that every deep diving sub that they built beyond 1,000 meters has been sold to a private individual who puts it on one of their yachts.
At what point?
Sorry, go ahead.
Were you complete with your thoughts, or I was just going to go on to the next question, or a follow-up to your statement?
Well, just completing that, the flip side of that. So our first innovation was, look, if what we're trying to do is open up access to the deep oceans, and one of the big limiting factors is money, because not everyone has tens of millions of dollars to do this, then we need to bring the costs down by at least one order of magnitude, if not 2. So one way of doing that would be to figure out a way of building cheaper subs. And that wasn't something we were interested in, didn't want to do. So the other way of bringing the cost down is to change the business model. And so the way we innovated the business model was basically to offer these subs on a charter basis. Back in 2009, if you wanted to charter a sub, there was nowhere you could go to charter a sub. Sadly, today, there are only 2 places you can go to charter a sub that I know of, and neither one of those operations has a sub that will go deeper than 1,000 meters. And so our objective. Our innovation initially was a business model innovation. We just went out as a charter and not as a sub builder. Sorry, Commander Whalen, you wanted to ask another question.
At what point, so 2009, 2010, at what point did you change the business model to then go to the charter and then to the actual building of a submersible? Was that while you were still involved with the company?
There's a couple of nuances in your question. So let me see the easiest way to answer that. So while I was still there, we started realizing that we were going to have to build our own stuff. That was definitely while I was there, and because we did start coming up with plans for how we would do this, right? That's also when we came up with a plan for. I think that's about the time that we started looking at carbon fiber as a potential alternative for pressure hull. And as Patrick mentioned before on Friday, that's not a novel idea. People have looked at carbon fiber before. In fact, we had both, Stockton and I had both been introduced to carbon fiber by Graham Hawks, who had developed at least designs for a full ocean depth sub using carbon fiber. So it wasn't innovative. It was just something that we started looking at while I was still there. So we started exploring the idea of a carbon fiber hull. We started exploring the idea of building our own sub, how we were going to do that. So that's about the time when we kind of came up with essentially a three-phase growth plan for the company. The first phase was the one we were in then, which was basically kind of the startup mode, get Antipodes, get comfortable with Antipodes, get comfortable with subs, operate the sub. Phase two was going to be get comfortable with building a sub. What does it take to build a sub? And then phase three was going to be actually having the deep diving subs that would end up being this fleet of five subs around the world. At least that was the discussions that we were having at the time while I was still there. So we kind of came up with that plan. The reason I thought your question was a little nuanced is because we did start implementing that plan while I was still there. For that phase two, where we were going to get practice building a sub, what we decided to do was, look, if we're serious about potentially having an innovative new material being used for the pressure hull, let's at least practice just building a sub with a standard hull. Let's go find a used sub with a standard classed titanium steel hull, and let's practice with that one. Let's go out and design some of the exterior elements and put them on a proven pressure vessel. And let's do that first. And let's test that out while we develop further this idea of a potential carbon fiber hull. And I think the idea at the time was, look, even if it turns out that the carbon fiber hull is not a viable option, at least we'll end up with two class titanium steel subs. And that's at least something we could do something with that as a business. So for that phase two, what we did is we found the Lula 500, which is I think it was ABS class sub out of the Azores that was for sale. We purchased that one, and we were going to bring it back to the United States, take it to Everett, strip it down to its pressure hull, and then rebuild it. And eventually that is what happened. That is what ended up becoming Cyclops. So one of the last things that I did while I was still with the company in January 2013 is I'd gone to the Azores, completed the purchase of the Lula 500 and put it in containers to ship it back to the US. And what I don't remember, I was actually trying to think of it this weekend, I don't remember if by the time I left, the sub had already arrived in Florida. I think it had. And then we put the containers on a flatbed truck and drove it across to Seattle. I don't remember if it had already left before I left or if it left as I left or something like that, but it was right about that time in the end of 2012, early 2013.
Thank you, sir. At this time, we're going to take a 5-minute break for a technical issue.
And hearing will recess and reconvene at 9:35. Okay, the hearing is now back in session. Thank you for your patience, sir, as we work through a couple sound issues.
Yep.
Sir, I just want to follow up on that in your last statement, or last questioning. So you had stated that at this point with the plan that you had realized that the cost of the plan began to be more than what you had anticipated. At this point, did you and Mr. Rush seek any additional funding to help raise capital to meet your plan?
Well, first of all, just for clarification, I don't think I said that the cost was too high, although that was certainly one of the factors. It was just that none of the sub builders could meet our business requirements, right? So if you think about our business requirements of being able to carry 5 people, 6,000 meters without a dedicated mothership, deployable anywhere in the world, none of the sub builders could really do that. Never mind the cost. And then if you did factor in the cost, yeah, it was going to be ridiculously expensive.
So at this point,
Yeah, sorry, but to answer your question, I don't remember exactly when we raised the first funding. I know Stockton had committed to put in a certain amount of seed funding in himself. And then as we built it out, I think he and his family put in a little bit more money. And then at some point we started doing what startups typically do. You start from there and then you work out to friends and family. And then eventually you raise money from third-party investors. And honestly, A, Stockton was the one spearheading the fundraising, and B, a lot of that fundraising got done after I left, so I don't really have a lot of insight into that.
with regards to the purchase of the Antipodes and the use of the Antipodes domestically, at this point, did you have somebody on staff who was well-versed in the regulatory oversight of submersibles for domestic operation?
Yes and no. So for almost everything related to Antipodes, the first thing we did is we brought in Pete Hoffman, who's the man who built Antipodes originally. We were the third owners of Antipodes. And so we brought in Pete from Florida. He helped us both with the sub and with the ABS compliance, and then also kind of talked us through a lot of the regulatory issues on it. That was number one. Number two, around that time is when I started getting, as the CEO of the company, I started getting involved with the Marine Technology Society's Manned Underwater Vehicles Committee, which is headed up by, or at the time was headed up by Will Conan. And so I would talk a lot with all of them, Will, Patrick, all those folks. And they helped educate me on a lot of the regulatory compliance issues. And honestly, I think at the time I was probably the one heading up the regulatory compliance. Keeping in mind that at the time, when we talk about regulatory compliance, we were talking about ABS classing the sub and complying with Coast Guard regs whenever we dove Antipodes in U.S. waters. But that was the extent of what I had to deal with while I was there.
Did you understand the limitations of a vessel certificated as a small passenger vessel?
Yes.
And at that time, what did you believe to be the Coast Guard regulations regarding small passenger vessels with submersible operations?
Where do you want to start? You know, there's sub operations, there's the building of the subs and all that stuff. Specifically, what I had to deal with the most is obviously the NAVIC 593, where my recollection now 10 plus years later of what that entailed was basically limiting submersibles to I believe it was three categories. One is recreational use, in which case the only people authorized to go in the sub are the sub owner and any guests, non-paying guests. The second category was passenger vessel, if you're going to charge somebody to go in. you basically had to comply. I think you talked through this with Patrick on Friday. You had to comply with the regulations that were established in the 1980s to accommodate Atlantis submarines, which, by the way, currently, as far as I understand, as of last year, are still the only 3 subs operating in U.S. waters. Are Atlantis tourist subs, one in Hawaii, one in Saipan, and one in Guam. And then the third category was Oceanographic Research Vessel, which was effectively the Coast Guard taking regulations that were originally designed for surface ships and kind of flipping them over and using them for submersibles. And in which case, the only people allowed to be in the subs were 3 categories, were the sub owners, the crew, and researchers.
And which of those 3 that you just explained did you feel that the Antipodes fell under?
So that, if you think about that, it's dependent on the actual dive, right? It's depending on the dive op. So sometimes you could say that we were operating as a recreational vessel because it was just the owners or guests. Sometimes we were operating as an ORV. We never operated as a passenger vessel, that I know, because there was no way we were going to be able to comply with the regulations for a passenger vessel. And by the way, no deep diving sub can comply with those regulations because they weren't created for that kind of a vessel.
Did you ever accept payment for a vessel dive or for somebody to come on board the vessel?
I believe we did under the auspices of the ORV. And in order to do that, one of the requirements, obviously Coast Guard, you already know this, but one of the requirements for complying with the ORV is you have to get approval from sector commanders. So when we operated the sub, I basically helped take the sub to, I guess, on 6 different, let's call them expeditions, in 4 different Coast Guard sectors: Puget Sound, San Francisco, LA, and Miami. And so for all of those, we had to, before we went, we had to sit down with the sector command and walk through everything that we were doing, make sure that we had all the documentation in place. And honestly, it was an interesting educational experience for me because I didn't realize, in their greater wisdom, the Coast Guard gives a lot of deference to sector commanders, knowing that each sector is different. And so as we went through this, each sector commander that we spoke with had a different tolerance for how to deal with this strange thing coming into their sector, right? You don't get a lot of subs operating in U.S. waters, especially deep diving subs, even though Antipodes was a shallow deep diving sub, 300 meters. And so some sector commanders were open to it. Some sector commanders just didn't want to have it in their waters because they didn't know what to do with it. Some sectors kind of changed because, as you know, sector commanders rotate every 2 or 3 years. And sometimes we'd get a good relationship with a good sector commander who understood what we were doing and was willing to work with us. And then we'd make plans to go. And then on the way there, they would rotate out, a new sector commander would come in and they'd change their minds, and then we'd have to scrap our plans. So, yeah, we worked as closely as we could with each of the Coast Guard sectors on this.
Recorder, I'm going to ask you to please bring up Exhibit 92. And Mr. Sohnlein, it should come up on your desktop.
Okay.
Which was a July 5th, 2012 article from Miami Today. And once you see it, sir, just please let me know.
Yeah, I can see it.
And do you recognize this article, sir?
I have no idea. Over the years, there's been a million articles written about a lot of stuff.
Roger, sir.
Is there a specific part you want me to look at?
Yes, sir. It'll be the bottom paragraph as on the bottom of the screen there. Mm-hmm. And it states, just scroll down a little bit more. There we go. It says, our expeditions, what we do is not tourism operation. He said, "Our expeditions are working in the field. Everyone has to participate. We allow citizen scientists to pay, but we hire them as part of the crew."
Excuse me.
Yes, OceanGate.
Do we know who is making this statement?
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask.
We do, sir. It was you.
Okay, that's what I thought. Go ahead.
Can you scroll down to the top of the next page? And it states, "His clientele come from all walks of life. They do have some financial resources. This is not cheap." He said costs can range from $7,500 to $40,000 per person, depending on the length and complexity of this mission.
Yeah.
And that was regarding your plan for the operations to begin in Miami in 2012.
Yeah, that probably sounds about right.
Do you remember this part of your business model?
Yes, it was basically trying to figure out what could be done under the ORV model in a way that that could generate a business model, right? Because if you think about it, under the ORV model, the only people that you could charge is researchers, and researchers generally don't have funds to fund this kind of work. And we were trying to find ways to get these researchers to the ocean where they wanted to be to go collect their data. And so we looked at a model that's been kind of perfected by an organization called Earthwatch, where they have people come out to, I think it's archaeological digs, and people pay money to go dig in the dirt and be part of these archaeological digs. And the reason they do that is to support the researchers' work. And so we were trying to figure out how we could get funding to fund the researchers who did not have the ability to pay for these kinds of expeditions. By the way, that's also one of the what we ended up doing, even while I was there, with OceanGate Foundation. Right, we were trying to figure out how to get scientists to go in these subs, and we thought that the number one cost driver for them was the chartering of the sub, and it turns out the greater cost for them was the cost of the data analysis afterwards. And so we created OceanGate Foundation as a way of paying for that part of their research so that they could do the work that they needed to do underwater.
Did you ever discuss this approach as originally discussed, as we stated in the article, with the Coast Guard Inspections Division? And what was their interpretation of what your business model was?
I don't remember which division we talked to where, and I don't remember what their take was on any of this stuff. But what I do know is we did not move the sub from Seattle to Miami until we knew that the Coast Guard sector was going to be okay with what we were doing there, because we were evaluating a lot of other places to take the sub. We looked at San Diego, we looked at St. Petersburg, we looked at Miami, we looked at a lot of different places to take the sub. Basically, we wanted to get it out of the Pacific Northwest and get it further south to get more viable diving days so that we'd get more experience with the sub. And so I talked to all of those sectors, explaining our business, explaining what we were doing. Honestly, for every sector, everywhere I went, I had to educate them on what an ORV was, and I had to explain to them what NAVIC 593 was. And they were constantly calling back to headquarters, because I think, Commander Whalen, I think you and I talked about, I think you had an expert at headquarters on this, and I think he recently retired in the last year. They were on the phone with him all the time, trying to get guidance on what to do with this strange thing that was coming into their sector. So I don't remember specifically who I talked with at the Coast Guard sector in Miami. I don't know specifically what they said. I'm sure there's got to be documentation somewhere. But I do know that there's no way we would have moved the sub to Miami if we didn't have a comfort level that the Coast Guard was going to be comfortable with what we were doing.
Recorder, can you please bring up Exhibit 002 and turn to page 11, which is the Antipodes Coast Guard Missile Activity Summary. And missile is an acronym which means Marine Information for Safety and Law Enforcement. And zoom in at the top there. Scroll down.
If I scroll down and go to the next
Okay,
page.
thank you. So, sir, it says the operator had requested permission to have operators pay for a course in operation of the sub to qualify as a sub pilot. We informed the operator that this would be considered passenger for hire consideration. And from there, it was denied. From there.
Yeah, and that's dated August 2012, right?
That is correct, sir. And then at that point.
Yeah, in short.
At that point, you then contacted Sector San Francisco.
Well, I don't know if I did because I left a few months after that. And by then we had already made the decision to stop operating Antipodes, and we were going to focus on building what ended up being Cyclops back in Everett. And we basically closed up shop in Miami, put Antipodes on a flatbed truck and drove it back to Everett. And all of that happened after I left. So I'm not familiar with this stuff. And by the way, August 2012 is also right about when I turned the company over to Stockton as CEO, and he was still based in Everett. And we started the process of shutting down Miami.
Thank you, sir. Recorder, can you please turn to page 17? I'm going to have to find the correct page, in which was a letter to Lieutenant Commander in the United States Coast Guard, dated September 17th, 2012. That's correct. And in this letter, do you recognize this letter, sir? Which was operations plan for Monterey 2012 expedition.
2012. Yeah, that does look for me. Wait, was this my letter? Did I sign this?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, because it looks like my formatting.
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah.
And the second paragraph states, even though we generally operate our submarine under an Oceanographic Research Vessel letter of designation issued by Sector Miami, during this expedition, we will not be getting paid cash or other consideration by anyone getting in the sub. Instead, we will be supporting two 501c3 nonprofit organizations, the Blue Ocean Film Festival during its biannual awareness building event, and the OceanGate Foundation during its annual education and outreach program to the Monterey community.
Yes.
So was this the new business model for OceanGate with regards to accepting consideration for these operations? To utilize the
'cause that's
OceanGate
not-
Foundation?
Oh, no, because that's not a business model. That doesn't get any money into OceanGate Inc. This was a way this was essentially what it says there, kind of raising awareness. This was kind of part of our marketing budget. No, because that's not a business model. You can't make money doing that.
And what was the relationship between OceanGate Foundation and OceanGate Inc.?
Well, as I said before, what primarily, at least at the time, what we were using it for was to pay for research grants for researchers to conduct their research. and to do kind of what it said there, kind of awareness building. What we would do, if like in Monterey, what we did is we took the sub there, and then we would put it on display, and the OceanGate Foundation would go out into the schools and bring kids out to look at the sub, or we would take our pilots into the schools to talk to the kids about careers in oceanographic research and in ocean engineering. It was very it was very what do you call it, bifurcated, right? The OceanGate Foundation dealt with education and science, and we dealt with operating the sub.
And so where did funding come from to operate the sub?
At that point, investors. Because at that point, I think we'd already started raising money for building Cyclops, and we knew there's no money in building a product, right? We were going to need funding for that. So if I remember correctly, I think we started raising some money right about then. And by the way, all of this is obviously in U.S. waters, right? And trying to comply with the Coast Guard's regulations. And as you are accurately pointing out, it is very difficult to operate in U.S. waters as a deep diving submersible under the ORV model. And that's why there aren't that many subs operating in U.S. waters. And I don't know how that is currently relative to other jurisdictions, but the Coast Guard is very, very clear and stringent about deep sub operations in U.S. waters.
So if OceanGate Inc. was responsible for the submersibles themselves, and OceanGate Foundation was responsible, as you said, for supporting researchers and basically research, how were the operations paid for, such as utilizing or paying for the support vessels and the vessels to tow the submersible out?
Well, as far as I remember, it was out of our Ocean Inc.'s operating budget, and that was from investors, as far as I know. I could be wrong, but again, this wasn't our business model, right? Remember that we were in the process of at the beginning of a 3-stage approach to get to a point where we could have a fleet of charterable subs. And it turns out, as we were doing our training wheels with Antipodes, we realized that fleet of deep diving submersibles that we wanted to have in our long-term vision, unfortunately, one of them was not going to be in U.S. waters because it was going to be too difficult to operate.
Were you still with the company when the board of directors began to form?
I think while I was there, we did have a board of directors. I think there were 4 or 5 of us, me, Stockton, and maybe 2 or 3 others. And I don't think we did much at the time other than have some regular meetings. But yes, we did have a board of directors while I was there.
Did each of the members, other than yourself and Mr. Rush, have a specific role or responsibility within the board?
Yeah, that I don't remember. Stockton was chairman of the board, and he ran the board. I was busy running the company, and so I honestly didn't pay much attention to the board dynamics. My job was, whenever we had a board meeting, was to present an update on company operations to the board.
Was anyone on the board at the time responsible for regulations or compliance?
I don't think so. Now, honestly, I'm trying to remember who was on the board during that time. But I don't think, I know at some point we brought Admiral Lockwood on board, former Coast Guard Admiral, but I think that was after I left. And he certainly wouldn't have been responsible, quote unquote, for it. So no, I don't think so.
When did you depart, or when did you leave the company, and what factors influenced your decision to depart?
Yeah, so I ended up leaving permanently end of January 2013. Like I said, in August, Stockton and I made a decision to transfer the CEO title from me to him, and he really wanted me to stay with the company. So we kind of decided to give me the COO title. I didn't think it would make sense for me to stay. So it was really ultimately my decision to leave. It was in large part what drove the change in CEO title from me to Stockton was that we were transitioning from that first phase to that second phase. And so we were transitioning from an operations phase to an engineering phase. And that was really his strength, not mine. And it made sense for him to take the reins of the company. Also, because we were entering into an engineering phase, to go to your earlier question, we were going to have to raise more money. And anyone who's raised money into an early stage company knows that at that stage, investors are not so much betting on the business model or on the technology, they're betting on the CEO. And since the investors were probably going to be friends of Stockton or somebody who knew Stockton, it just made sense from a business strategy perspective for him to be CEO. So we made that decision, and that was a fairly easy decision. The tougher decision was whether or not I should stay. And he wanted me to stay. He wanted me to be COO, Chief Operating Officer, and keep running the company. But it didn't make sense for a number of different reasons, right? One is we weren't really going to be operating. We were going to be building. And there wasn't going to be much for me to do in terms of operations, number one. Number two, every time you take a founder, CEO, and bring in a new CEO and keep that other former CEO in the company, it's confusing to the team. It's almost like, you run the risk of, the new CEO telling the team to do something and they don't agree with it. So they go running to the other former CEO, and now you've got internal conflict already. It's kind of like children playing their two parents against each other. So just in general, I don't think it's good practice to keep the former co-founder CEO in the company. And and also from a practical standpoint, I was getting paid $120,000 a year at the time, and it just didn't make sense financially to keep paying me that kind of salary when I wasn't really going to be doing much other than overseeing business operations. It would have been much better for the company to take that money and hire maybe a couple of $60,000 a year engineers, or use the money to hire a senior engineer. I don't know. But as a shareholder in the company, it just didn't make financial sense for me to stay. And and I have to say this, even though it was my decision, it was one of the hardest decisions I had to make to leave this company. Because while I was there, I told many of my friends, I thought this was going to be the last job I ever had. I could envision myself being with OceanGate until I retired for 30, 40, 50 years. And so leaving OceanGate was tough. It was tough for me psychologically. It was tough emotionally. It's almost like anyone who started a company, you kind of treat your startup like one of your children, right? And at some point, for the good of the company, you have to leave and you have to let it go and let it grow. And honestly, looking back, if I had stayed, I think I would have just held the company back. It would not have accomplished everything that it accomplished with me still there. So in retrospect, I was glad I left for the good of the company. But yeah, it was a difficult decision.
You had mentioned the word team and the effect that position changes would have on them. How many employees were there at OceanGate at the time?
Ooh, now you're asking me to reach way back. I want to say anywhere from 10 to 12. I don't know, somewhere in that range.
And that was just so for the date, we're clear, that was in 2013 that you departed the company?
Yeah, so as we made these decisions to transition from operations to engineering, I think almost everybody, maybe there were a couple people back in Everett, the rest were in Miami. And yeah, we were going to have to relocate some of them back to Everett, or we were going to have to let them go in Miami and hire new people back in Everett for different roles.
So you did move operations to Miami? at some point?
Yes, in early 2012. So I think we lasted there not more than a year.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Did you retain any financial interest in the company following your departure?
Yes, I think from the beginning to this day, I think I still have my same 500,000 common shares in the company. I stopped keeping track of it ages ago because we raised so much money with preferred shareholders with liquidity preferences above me that I just basically resigned myself to the fact that I'm probably never going to see anything out of that equity stake. But yes, I think to this day, I still have my shares in the company.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have for you, sir.
Sir, Mr. Fawcett now has some questions for you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. In your location, thank you for being here. My name is Keith Fawcett. So were you actually a member of the Marine Technology Society?
Well, more than that, I was a member of the MTS. I was a member of the Manned Underwater Vehicles Committee, which was chaired by Will Conan. And for, I think, a year or two, I was chair of the MTS Ocean Exploration Committee.
So my questions relate to the same time frame as Commander Whalen's, up until including the accident day, June 18, 2023. So were you aware that during 2018, a group of volunteers at the Marine Technology Society had drafted a letter of concern about OceanGate operations in draft form? I
learned about that afterwards. In fact, I don't even know how I learned about that. Obviously, by then, I not only left the company, I was no longer a member of MTS, and I was not an active participant in the committees. But yeah, honestly, I don't even remember how I learned about that.
As a former member, do you recall seeing that draft letter?
No, in fact, to this day, I've never read it.
I believe there was testimony that he was not a member of that committee at the time, or that organization at the time it was drafted, so.
Okay, I understand. So I guess, let me rephrase the question. Even though you were not a member of the MTS, did you ever see a draft of the letter of concern ahead of the accident, sir?
No. And to this day, I've never read it. I've never seen it.
Thank you, sir. So the board of directors at OceanGate, what was the purpose of the board?
What was the purpose of any board, or that board in particular at
No,
that
that
time?
board. That board, sir.
That's a good question, because board of directors evolve over time as the organization evolves. I think in the early days of any startup, and including OceanGate, the board of directors is really there kind of to provide kind of regulatory mandated corporate oversight. And I think early on in a small board, in a startup board, it's usually a small board, and you usually have the co-founders and maybe one or two people as, tiebreakers in any sort of strategic vote. So I think at the time, the board, just like with any other startup, the board in early stages doesn't have a lot of responsibilities. It's there to kind of prepare the company for a future growth phase, and to be kind of a sounding board for the management team, specifically the CEO.
Did OceanGate Foundation have a board of directors?
I believe that what we called it was a board of trustees, I think. But yes, it did. And in fact, for when we founded it, I was one of the trustees. And then we quickly realized that was our first, any of us, that was our first dealing with 501c3s. And we realized that the IRS was going to have a problem with too much overlap between the for-profit company and the foundation. So I stepped down from the board, and I basically ceased all my activities with the foundation and just focused exclusively on OceanGate Inc.
So do you recall if the bylaws of OceanGate and the board of directors required minutes of those board meetings to be created?
Ooh, no, I do not remember that.
And then you mentioned retired Coast Guard Admiral John Lockwood. When did you not specific dates, but when did you become aware of that individual, retired Coast Guard Admiral Lockwood?
I don't remember. In fact, I'm trying to remember if I've even met him in person. And I don't remember how Stockton met him either. But I know Stockton spoke very highly of him and really wanted him involved in the company. But honestly, I don't remember if that was while I was still there or not.
Do you know what expertise he was expected to bring to the OceanGate Board of Directors?
No, but I imagine it had to do with the fact that he was a retired Coast Guard admiral, right? And as Commander Whalen asked earlier, maybe help us figure out how to navigate through some of the Coast Guard regulations so that we could operate in U.S. waters.
So at any time, did OceanGate or anyone working as a contractor for OceanGate, were they employed to deal with the question of passengers? In other words, it's a very complex term. We talk about mission specialists, compensation, and so forth. So did OceanGate, to your knowledge, employ somebody to help you, for example, with the specific definition of mission specialist?
Objection.
Okay.
I'm not
Understand,
sure about-
OceanGate.
I don't know if Mr. Sohnlein understood the question, but I did not.
Understand, and I don't think we've discussed mission specialists yet
Okay.
with
Do
this witness.
you understand what a mission specialist is with regards to OceanGate?
Yeah, but I was going to ask you for clarification on what you mean by helping me deal with it. Like, do you mean like somebody who understood the regulations and was going to help us with regulatory compliance? Is that what you mean?
Yes, correct. In other words, the people that pay with OceanGate to go on the submersible are called mission specialists. So
Is that a question for Mr. Sohnlein?
Yeah, I don't really understand the question, sir. Can you rephrase, Mr. Fawcett?
yes, did someone help or contract to help create the definition of mission specialist related to OceanGate operations?
From a marketing perspective or from a regulatory perspective? From a marketing perspective, yes, because we had marketing people on board. From a regulatory perspective, no, I don't think so. I don't remember hiring anybody to specifically deal with that.
And were the submersibles operated while you were there at OceanGate, were they insured for their operations?
So I know you said submersibles plural, but while I was there, we just had the one. We just had Antipodes. And I do not remember if they were insured or not. I don't remember.
That's all the questions I have, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, at this time, I'd like to transfer the questioning over to the National Transportation Safety Board. Mr. Muse?
Good afternoon, sir. You said you get to visit several different sector commands around the country.
Mm-hmm.
And they had different requirements, obviously. Did any of them ask for emergency response plans that would help out in a search and rescue case?
Every one of them. I think it was part of operating as an ORV.
That's an ORV, okay. How about, did any of them ask for some sort of state registration? I noticed that, I believe both Antipodes and Cyclops are registered in Washington. Was that original, or did one of the sector commanders ask for that?
Yeah, I don't remember anybody asking for that, but we did register Antipodes. That was one of the first things. That was one of my first exposures to regulatory compliance with a submersible. I had to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles in Washington and fill out a form, and I had to check a box for what I was trying to register, and there was no box. Surprise, surprise, there was no box for submersible. I had to go ask one of the clerks what box I should check, and I described it. She said, "Well, why don't you check the box for what was it? Submerged platform or something like that." And so that's what I had to do to get the registration number for Antipodes. And so, yeah, I don't think anybody asked us for it, but we had it. And so we just provided it wherever we went.
Both Cyclops and Antipodes were classed before you purchased them. Did they have any sort of flag registration where they were operating before?
Okay, just point of clarification. We did not buy Cyclops. We built Cyclops. What we bought was the Lula 500 from the Azores. And as far as flagging them, they're prior. I don't remember. Like I said, we were the third owners of Antipodes. The second owners were a tourism operation out of New Zealand. And I don't remember if it was flagged in New Zealand. As Tim Catterson testified last week, he was the chief pilot for the second owner. Maybe he remembers. I don't know. And for the Lula 500, the people that we bought it from, the organization that we bought it from, is now operating the Lula 1000. And they may know if they were flagged in the Azores, but I don't remember.
Did Lula 500 come with its own Lars platform, or is that something you built in the transition to Cyclops?
No, actually, if we go back to Commander Whalen's questioning about the business model and why we didn't want a dedicated mothership, this was something that we started developing even with Antipodes, even while we had Antipodes, because we knew that having at the time we called it an LRT, a launch retrieval and transport system, that was going to be key to bringing down the cost of operations and thereby kind of opening up access to the oceans by using smaller ships. And we didn't come up with that idea on our own. That was something that the University of Hawaii had pioneered for years when they were diving their Pisces 4 and 5 subs. Their LRT allowed them to not have to have a ship with a crane, and they would tow the subs out to dive sites and then submerge them with the LRT. They were very helpful with us. They shared with us a lot of their designs and their plans for their LRT, and we took that and started modifying it for our uses. So we started doing that even while I was there. Started doing some rudimentary tests with it back then. So no, neither the Lula 500 nor Antipodes came with an LRT, but we did build the system.
Was there any discussion with the Coast Guard on updating the NAVIC to maybe help you meet your business goals? I mean, at this point, it's 20 years old in the time frame we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, we had discussions with the Coast Guard on updating that back then, and you can ask Will Conan when he testifies. We just had discussions with him as recently as last fall, and Will had an amazing interaction with him, which I thought was very fascinating. But look, at the end of the day, there's kind of a chicken and egg kind of thing, right? No sub is going to come operate in U.S. waters because the NAVIC doesn't really allow for flexibility to do that in a way that makes sense, business sense for the sub operator. And on the other hand, the Coast Guard has no incentive to change or update NAVIC 593 until there is a sub operating in U.S. waters. So it's a chicken and egg thing. And Will can testify to the interaction he had with the Coast Guard representative at the conference last or last year, but at one point, the Coast Guard representative gave a great answer. Will said, look, if you don't change the NAVIC 593, we're never going to have deep diving subs operating in U.S. waters. And his response was, I understand that, but that's not my mandate. My mandate is not economic development. My mandate is public safety. And it would be a waste of taxpayer money to develop new regulations when there's no one to use them. And so it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, and I don't envision that changing anytime in the near future, because honestly, as an American taxpayer, I agree with the Coast Guard, right? Until there's a need for it, it's a waste of taxpayer money to update that NAVIC 593. And that is how the NAVIC was updated, 40 years ago. There was a company that wanted to bring subs into U.S. waters, and so there was a justification for it back then.
Are there other national regulatory schemes around the world that we could possibly emulate or get ideas from? I know the UK has some, the French, we heard last week that the Cayman Islands have something. Are there any ideas there that we can turn to?
I don't know, because the entire time I was at OceanGate, we only operated in U.S. waters, and that was the only thing I was familiar with. But Will Conan is probably the best person to ask about that.
What do you think is the best platform to regulate this industry? Would it be the IMO or individual flag states, or should we just rely on class, or just go with industry standards?
That's always a difficult question to ask an operator, because that's not my wheelhouse, right? That's not what I would do. What I will say is this is not an industry, right? We talk about industry standards. This is not an industry. It's at most, again, you can ask Will Conan, he'll have the numbers, but it's at most 100 subs in the world operating. And if you're talking about deep diving subs, there's probably less than 10. I can only think of 6, and that's including the 5 government subs. It's not really an industry, and so coming up with even standards is difficult to do, in an emerging kind of field like this. So I don't know what the right way is to regulate this kind of activity. And I probably wouldn't look at the submersible world. I'd look to other fields to see what they did in their regulatory scheme. Like, for example, right now there's a big push worldwide with eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, or air taxis. Maybe that's somewhere to look. I don't know, but that's certainly not my expertise.
Okay, thank you for that. Antipodes was built in the UK. Do I have that right?
Ooh, now you're digging way back. So
it was not built in the U.S. It's not American built, though. Is that correct?
I do not. So the original sub was a Perry class diver lockout system, a Perry 1201, and I think Perry was a UK company. So yes, originally it was built in the UK.
So even if we were to update the regulations or the NAVIC to allow you to carry passengers to depths, both Cyclops and Antipodes, the law would prevent you from carrying passengers in U.S. waters anyway. Do I understand that right?
I'd have to dig into that more. I don't know. Because, for example, like I said, Antipodes, the Perry 1201 was built in the UK, but Antipodes was basically the front third of the PC 1201. It was the pilot section of the 1201, and that work was done in Florida. So I don't know if carving up an existing large sub and turning it into a smaller sub qualifies as being built in the US for legal and regulatory purposes. I have no idea. I have to look at that. Likewise with Cyclops, I don't remember where the Lula 500 was built. I think Patrick Leahy would probably know, because I think he was involved with it. But the fact that stripping it down to its pressure hull and reassembling it as something new called Cyclops, and that was done in the US, I don't know if that would qualify under the Jones Act for this kind of thing.
Okay, and lastly, did Mr. Hawks, or what What lessons did Mr. Hawks share about building carbon fiber hulls, or any lessons learned from the one that he had built, was later called the Deep Flight Challenger, I believe?
Yes, correct. I don't remember, because a lot of that were lessons learned from an engineering perspective. So those were conversations that he would have with Stockton, since they're both aerospace engineers and they were both looking at that. The thing I do remember is him saying that carbon fiber is doable, it's viable for certain uses underwater. I don't know if he meant for full ocean depth. I don't know if he meant for 4,000 meters. I don't know if he meant for 30 meters. But I think right now he's probably the world's leading expert on using carbon fiber for pressure vessels for deep submersibles.
Okay, thank you for your time today.
Sir, this is Jason Neubauer. I just have a couple follow-up questions from the initial lines. Sir, after you departed OceanGate, did anyone from the MTS ever reach out to you with safety concerns regarding OceanGate's Titan expeditions to the Titanic wreckage?
I don't think so. I think I would have remembered if they did. No.
Sir, during the Antipodes operations, were the guests who were donating or paying for the excursions limited to scientists?
No. I think that's about when we started, like I said earlier, I think that's when we started experimenting with this concept of a mission specialist, kind of borrowing from the Earthwatch model. And so what we would do is we would have people who would kind of be trained on fulfilling different functions within the dive, whether it was assisting the pilot or assisting the researcher or assisting the data collection.
And sir, when you met with the various Coast Guard sector commanders, would you make the argument that those mission specialists were part of the crew of the Oceanographic Research Vessel?
So honestly, because this was so critical and so important, and yet so vague, at least every conversation I had with the Coast Guard, I was open with them, and I just told them, look, here's because again, most of the sector commanders had never even seen a NAVIC 593 or didn't know what an ORV was when it came to subs. And I had to explain to them what we were trying to do. And I would explain to them, look, this is what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to create a financial model that allows us to find a way of funding oceanographic research in a way that currently can't be done because researchers don't have the funds to do this. And we're trying to do this in US waters. We're trying to comply with the ORV regulations. And this is what we've come up with. And we realize this is kind of shoehorning it in, but this is how we're kind of, trying to meet the requirements of both our business and the Coast Guard. And I was just, personally, I was in conversations. I was upfront with the Coast Guard and tried getting them to help me figure out how to make this all work. And like I said, some of the sector commands were open to that, and some of them said, no, it's clearly you're a passenger vessel, and I'm not going to let you operate in our sector.
And sir, along those, to follow up on that, do you remember the actual areas that the Antipodes ended up operating in?
Yeah, so obviously in Puget Sound, so we operated there. We operated in, while I was there, we operated in Monterey, California, and that fell under the San Francisco sector. We operated in Catalina Island, which fell under the LA Long Beach sector. And then we operated off the coast of Miami, which obviously fell under the Miami sector. And by the way, one of the reasons, the letter that Commander Whalen put up earlier from August 2012 from the Coast Guard. The reason it was dated then, even though we had moved there in January, is because when we first got there, we were doing training dives, right? We had never operated on the Atlantic Ocean. We had never operated on the East Coast. And so a lot of what we were doing was training dives. And when I got there, I had to hire a bunch of new people. And so we spent a long time, like months, just learning how to dive the sub safely, and how to do it basically within 5 miles of Miami. So it really, initially, we didn't really need that kind of approval because it was basically training dives. But when we got to the point where we felt comfortable diving in Miami and we were going to try kind of pushing this mission specialist business model, that's when we asked for approval from the Coast Guard. But we had already, like I said before, we had already had these discussions with the Coast Guard before we made the decision to move to Miami.
Thank you, sir. And just to clarify then, can you clarify which areas you dove with mission specialists out of the areas you just provided before?
You mean paying mission specialists, right?
Yes, sir.
I don't remember, because we did not do it in Miami. And by the way, one of the reasons, just a quick finishing up that thought on the letter from the Coast Guard in Miami, now that I'm kind of thinking through this, I remember being disappointed that we got rejected because we had done so much prep work before we moved to Miami. And I remember one of the things that happened is that was one of the sectors that I believe had a change in sector commander from the time we made the decision until we went. And the new sector commander just didn't like the idea of having subs in his sector, which made sense because at the time, both the Coast Guard and the Border Patrol were dealing with drug cartels from South America using submersibles to smuggle drugs into U.S. waters, specifically in South Florida. So I could totally understand, why they weren't comfortable with that. So we didn't do it there. We didn't do it in Catalina. We didn't do it in Puget Sound. Did we do it the first time? We had two expeditions to Monterey, as you pointed out earlier. The second one was for market awareness. Maybe we did it on the first one. Honestly, I don't remember. I don't remember if anyone actually ever paid, now that I think about it. But obviously, I'd have to go back and look at the financial records and see what actually happened back then.
Thank you, sir. And just one last follow-up on that. Was it your perception that even after the Coast Guard local sector commanders would consult with headquarters, that the decisions were inconsistent, in your opinion?
Within the sectors that were comfortable with us operating, no, I think they were consistent. And within the sectors that didn't want us operating, I think they were consistent. I think what was inconsistent was whether or not they were comfortable with us diving there or operating there or not. But again, I could understand it because the sector commanders had a certain amount of discretion. And I could understand why Miami and LA may think differently than Seattle or San Francisco or Baltimore. So yeah, it was, I think they were consistent within the two categories of denial or acceptance. I don't know if that's answers your question, but yeah.
It does. And sir, I have one other question. Were you aware that if under domestic certification, like the Atlanta submarines, that the depth of the dives would be greatly limited?
Yeah, actually, someone mentioned earlier that, even if the regulations allowed us to take paying passengers, would that have made a difference? The limitation for us wasn't necessarily the getting paid part, although that was a part of it. the limitation with the NAVIC 593 is on the operations. And I mean, the requirements are ridiculous because they were written for Atlanta subs, right? So for example, one of the requirements, I don't know if it's still the same, but what I remember from back then, one of the requirements is that the sub pilot had to have a Coast Guard 100-ton captain's license, which of course made sense if you're operating an Atlanta submarine that's carrying 70 people. But when you're piloting Antipodes, which is like 15 feet long and carries 5 people, it just doesn't make sense to require the sub pilot to have a 100-ton license. Likewise, the passenger vessel, at least back then, if I remember correctly, I don't know what it is now, the passenger vessel had to follow a pre-approved route every single time. You know, for us, we called it, you know, the tour bus, right? It's basically you're kind of doing laps around a lagoon, which makes sense. It's perfectly great for a tourism business. But when you're carrying out deep ocean exploration and research, you have no idea where you're going. You know generally where you're going, but you don't know what path you're going to take or what route you're going to take. And we certainly weren't going to follow it every single time, right? Researchers needed to move around, explorers needed to move around, filmmakers needed to move around. And so it was a lot of the operational restrictions that hurt us more than anything else.
Understand. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to go to OceanGate Council for any questions.
No questions, thank you.
Does the board have any final questions for this witness? Mr. Fawcett?
To your knowledge, sir, were mission specialists ever paid?
I don't know. So, it's interesting because as we're talking, it's kind of jarring my memory and jogging some thoughts. You know, as we went through a lot of this interaction with the Coast Guard, and the sector commanders or their staffs that were trying to help us figure out how to get this done in a way that made sense for us and also complied with regulations. One of the thoughts that we had at one point was, well, under an ORV, one of the categories that's allowed to be in the sub are owners of the subs. So we actually thought about, at one point, I don't think we ended up doing this, but we actually toyed with the idea of giving every mission specialist a share of ownership in the company, right? Because, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but at least it would help them qualify as legitimate owners of the sub. We ended up not doing that because it was just going to be horrendously, logistically, a nightmare. So one of the other categories of people that could be in the sub were crew. And so we actually thought about, well, what if we pay crew members, mission specialists, and maybe we pay them $1? You know, it's consideration. Again, it sounds ridiculous, but we thought, and some of the Coast Guard sectors thought, you know, I don't know, maybe that would qualify. I don't know. I don't think we ended up doing that though. Again, I'd have to check. I don't think we ended up paying anybody. What we ended up defaulting to was the last category, which was researchers. And researchers within the ORV, if I remember correctly, was defined broadly enough that it could include people who were in training and people who were learning or people who were assisting a researcher. And ultimately, I think that's what we ended up defaulting to. And that's the part of the ORV that we ended up going through.
So were you offered an opportunity to take a dive on the Titan?
Many times.
And did you take a dive on the Titan?
No, but two thoughts on that. One is every year that Titan went to Titanic, Stockton would always call me before we went to see if I wanted to go. He wanted me there. Even if I was just on surface ops, I didn't have to go on a dive. I didn't, as a shareholder, I didn't want to take up room in the sub. I wanted to make that available for the people that the dive was intended for. And I never went on any of the expeditions. But the reason I didn't go is because neither Stockton nor I were ever driven by tourism. We were never motivated by going somewhere that people had already been before. Well, the reason we got into this was because we both wanted to explore. We wanted to not only explore ourselves, but create the technologies that would allow other explorers to explore the ocean. So going to see a shipwreck that had already been well documented and that a bunch of people had already gone to, that didn't excite me. It didn't excite Stockton. So I never really had a desire to go on any of the expeditions. And I wanted to make room on the sub for people like Renata, who that was their life dream, to go to the Titanic. Well, great, let her go. I don't have to go. Now that's for the Titanic expeditions. Now for diving Titan in particular, I will tell you this. Before the first crewed test dive of Titan, the first time that anybody was in the sub when Titan went down to 4,000 meters, as you already know, that dive was done by Stockton by himself. And he and I talked a month or two before he went down there. And he was telling me that it was finally time to actually take Titan on a test dive. And I believe that was Titan 1, the first hull. And he said, basically he was telling me it's time to put a human in there and we're going to do the test dive. And I said, well, I'm assuming you're going to pilot it. And he says, yeah, I'm piloting it. I said, great. Who else is going with you? And he said, nobody. I said, what do you mean nobody? He goes, I don't want anybody else in the sub. If anything happens, I want it to only impact me. It's my design. I believe in it. I trust it, but I don't want to risk anybody else. And I'm going to go by myself. Now, I've been on long dives before, and I know making a long dive by yourself, especially a test dive, is not a fun activity. And so my response to him at the time, I kind of felt like I was reliving the graduation scene from the original Top Gun. I felt like the character Viper. I kind of told him the same thing Viper told Maverick. I said, look, you're going to go by yourself, but if you get down there and you feel that you need a co-pilot, give me a call and I'll dive with you. And he said, thanks, I appreciate it, but I think I'm going to have to do this one by myself.
So you mentioned long dives. Are you referring to dives in submersibles to the deep ocean depths of approximately 3,000 meters?
No. You mean from my personal experience?
Yes, sir.
No. I think the deepest I ever dove was with Antipodes, 300 meters. But one thing that we did as a test dive in Miami, we always said that Antipodes carried 8 to 10 hours of life support and consumables, in addition to the 72 hours of emergency life support. But one of the things that we realized is our average duration of our dives was only like 2.5 hours. We were never really down. I think the longest dive we did was like 3 hours, maybe 4 hours. And the rationale for that was, it gets uncomfortable after a while to be in the sub that long. And so there was no reason to really make anybody uncomfortable. And so we never really dove that long. But one of the things that we thought about while we were in Miami is, look, if we're going to keep saying that the sub can dive for 8 to 10 hours, we should dive it for 8 to 10 hours and test the limits of it. So we did create a dive plan where me and one of the other sub pilots and our research director at the time, where the three of us went in the sub and we dove it for 8 hours. I think the deepest we went was like 800 feet. But
Yeah, 8 hours was more than enough time for me as far as staying in a sub. And I was there with two other people. I can't imagine being in a sub that long by yourself the way Jim Cameron was when he went down to Challenger Deep.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sir, just one quick follow-up. Back in 2012, OceanGate Expeditions was operating the Antipodes. We believe that they attempted to file as a foreign company in Florida. Do you remember that, sir? Is that accurate?
Well, so first of all, you said OceanGate Expeditions. As far as I know, OceanGate Expeditions was a subsidiary, something that was a separate legal entity that was created later after I left.
Sir, I'll just rephrase then. Do you know if there was ever talk about filing as a foreign company and operating in the U.S.?
Okay, now you changed the question because now you said
Sure.
in the U.S. Because registering as a foreign company in Florida, yeah, we probably had to do that because it's considered a foreign company if it's coming from another state. And if we were going to have employees in Florida, we probably did need to file as a foreign company in the state of Florida. As far as filing as a foreign company in the U.S., I don't know where we'd be filing from because we were an American company. I don't know.
Sir, no, that explains, I think that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Are there any further questions from the board at this time? Thank you, sir. Do you have anything that you'd like to offer to the board that we have not asked you at this time, sir?
Yeah, probably about 5 hours worth, but I know we don't have time for that. Maybe I just give some closing thoughts, if you don't mind. As I think back through everything that's happened over the last year, this was not supposed to happen, right? This shouldn't have happened. 5 people should not have lost their lives. 4 families should not be mourning their loved ones. And I don't know what happened. I don't know who made what decision when and based on what information. And honestly, I don't know if any of us will ever know this, despite all of your team's investigative efforts. I don't know if we'll ever know the answers to all of this. And regardless, as Renata said last week, none of this is going to bring our friends back. However, I hope that all of us can find some good in all of this sadness. I hope that we can find some silver linings. I hope we can find some valuable lessons learned that we can all carry forward and continue exploring the deep oceans, and in some way do that to preserve the legacies of the 5 people who lost their lives. And thinking back to last week, Patrick Leahy said it very eloquently, right? The deep ocean is a magical place. And like Patrick, I hope that many, 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 many more people will get to experience it firsthand. But it looks like OceanGate's not going to be a part of that effort. And so I can only hope that others will be inspired by the mission that Stockton and I started back in 2009, and that so many dedicated OceanGate team members, investors, partners, mission specialists contributed to over the years since that founding. And this can't be the end of deep ocean exploration. This can't be the end of deep diving submersibles, and I don't believe that it will be. But I hope that someday in the near future, we'll look back on this time as a major turning point in human history when the global general public finally took an active interest in all of our efforts, everything that all of us do to explore the deep oceans, to study them, and to preserve them. And I think if that happens, then that's probably the most fitting tribute for the memories of these 5 individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sohnlein, you are now released as a witness to this Marine Board investigation. Thank you for your time and cooperation. If I need to reach you for further information, I will contact you directly. If you have any future questions or concerns about these proceedings, you may contact our recorder, Lieutenant Kelly Steele. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you.
Our next witness will be Mr. Roy Thomas with the American Bureau of Shipping. We will take a recess and reconvene at 11 a.m. Thank you.